Welcome back. This is Midnight Crime. If you enjoy falling asleep to these stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And before we begin, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from tonight? Alright, let's head straight into our first story. Case 1. She was 23, living alone on the top floor of a quiet apartment building, when a pair of gloves appeared on her doorstep. No note, no indication of who left them, just the gloves, neatly folded. The faint scent of antiseptic lingered on the fabric, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching her. She stared at the gloves for a long moment, turning them over in her hands. They were ordinary, black leather, soft, supple, but something about the way they were folded made her stomach tighten. She set them on the small kitchen counter and walked to the window, pressing her forehead to the cool glass. The city below hummed with quiet life, a stray car's headlights flickering along the empty street, the low rumble of the subway beneath the pavement, a neighbor dragging a bag of recycling down the hall. Nothing seemed out of place, yet every shadow in the corner of her apartment felt heavier. The next day, she found herself lingering near the mailroom on her way out. She moved deliberately, feigning interest in the stack of letters while scanning the hallway. Nothing, no one, but the smell of antiseptic seemed to linger in the air around her staircase, a faint chemical tang that made her pulse quicken. She pressed a hand to the banister, feeling the chill of metal under her fingers, and noticed a small scuff on the wall, a smear that almost looked like a fingerprint. She frowned, brushing it lightly with her thumb. The paint was soft. The mark came away faintly, leaving her with a strange residue she couldn't identify. Later that evening, she wandered into the small convenience store across the street. It was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs flickering intermittently, casting long shadows across shelves of packaged snacks. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a calm, neutral expression, nodded at her without words. She wandered between aisles, almost absent-mindedly picking up a small pack of tea and feeling the leather gloves in the pocket of her coat. On impulse, she asked the clerk if anyone unusual had been around recently. People asking for directions, loitering near the building. He shook his head slowly. She left with the tea, walking along the narrow sidewalk that ran behind the block of shops, where the evening light dimmed into a pale, gray dusk. The air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and exhaust. A narrow alley caught her attention. Trash bins lined one side, the other wall covered in faded graffiti. She paused, noticing a small scrap of paper stuck to the ground, half-soaked and curling. She bent down carefully and picked it up. It was blank on one side, but the other carried a smudge of red ink. Not words, just a streak, like something had been wiped away hastily. At home, she laid the scrap on the counter beside the gloves. The two objects felt connected somehow, though she couldn't yet say why. She ran her fingers over the gloves' stitching again, noticing a tiny loose thread near the wrist, barely visible, but different from the rest. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made her pause. Over the next few nights, she began noticing small changes. A flicker of movement in the corner of her apartment when she thought she was alone, a low creak outside her door in the middle of the night, the faint metallic scent that seemed to hover in the air when she returned from the street. She tried to tell herself it was imagination, but even small details, the tilt of a picture frame, the position of a chair, started to feel slightly off. One rainy evening, she decided to explore the old park at the edge of the neighborhood. It was nearly deserted, the wet benches glistening, leaves sticking to the pavement in small, dark patches. She wandered slowly along the paths, glancing at the worn lampposts that barely illuminated the misty air. Near the back, she noticed a set of footprints in the mud. Two lines, close together, small and deliberate. They led toward the rusted gate at the edge of the park and stopped abruptly. She crouched, noticing a tiny thread caught on a thorn bush. It was black, like the gloves. Returning home, she laid everything out: the gloves, the paper scrap, the thread from the park. Alone in her apartment, with the city muffled outside, the air smelled faintly of wet leather and antiseptic. She traced the thread with her fingers again, thinking about the footprints, the alley, the scuff on the stairwell. Nothing made sense yet, and that, she realized, was the most unsettling part: the quiet, creeping certainty that someone was moving just beyond her perception. She didn't sleep well that night. The lights flickered, the soft hum of the building seemed louder, and every creak in the hallway made her pulse jump. But beneath the anxiety was a strange, steady curiosity. She began keeping a small notebook by her bed, writing down the patterns she noticed, the odd scents, the subtle movements, the things she might have dismissed before. Every line she wrote felt like a thread she could follow, each detail a possible connection. And though she didn't know it yet, the gloves had only just begun to leave traces of the story waiting to unfold. The following morning, she left her apartment earlier than usual, taking a longer route to the corner cafe she frequented on weekdays. The streets were quiet, slick with leftover rain, and the air smelled faintly of wet stone and exhaust. She kept her coat collar high, the gloves still tucked into the pocket, a constant weight against her thigh. Inside the cafe, the scent of warm bread and coffee enveloped her, comforting in contrast to the tension that had settled in her chest. She chose a corner table near the window, where the light was muted and soft. The barista, a young woman with a faint scar along her jaw, nodded in greeting without words. She watched the door as she sipped her tea, eyes flicking to the patrons, an older man reading a newspaper, a mother with a restless child, but no one drew her attention. After a while, she noticed something odd on the floor near the counter. A single, tiny thread, black, frayed at the end. She crouched and picked it up with a fingertip. It was soft, leather-like, almost certainly from the gloves, though she couldn't understand how it had ended up here. She slipped it into her notebook, alongside the thread from the park and the scuff on the stairwell. That evening, she wandered toward the waterfront. The docks were quiet, lit only by scattered lamps that reflected off the rippling water. Old warehouses loomed along the edge, their windows dark and streaked with grime. She walked slowly, noticing details: a rusted chain dangling from a hook, the faint smell of salt and oil, a cluster of pigeons stirring in the shadows. Near one warehouse, a crumpled piece of paper fluttered across the pavement. She bent to retrieve it. It was a receipt, partially torn, dated 2 days earlier, listing a small hardware purchase: a box of nails, a coil of rope. No name. Back in her apartment, she spread her findings across the counter. The gloves, threads, paper scrap, and now the receipt formed a scattered constellation of small, seemingly unrelated objects. She traced the edges of the leather with her fingers, noting the tiny imperfections, the fold lines, the faint sheen that caught the light. Sleep was uneasy. She woke to the sound of soft tapping against her window. Half asleep, she assumed it was rain, but the night was dry. Pulling on a sweater over her nightdress, she crossed the room and parted the curtain. The fire escape was empty, slick metal reflecting the dim streetlight. Nothing. The next morning, she explored the alley behind the convenience store again. The graffiti had faded further with the rain, and a discarded shopping bag lay against a wall. As she approached, she noticed a faint smear along the edge of a metal shutter. Red, almost imperceptible, as though something had brushed against it in a hurry. She traced it with a gloved fingertip. It was sticky, lingering. She tore a small corner of paper from her notebook and pressed it against the mark, lifting a faint pattern. Later, she found herself at the library, drawn to the local archives. The building smelled of dust and varnish, a heavy, comforting scent. She moved among the shelves slowly, noting the quiet hum of the ventilation, the soft padding of other visitors' footsteps. At a reference table, she requested city records for the area surrounding her apartment. As she flipped through old permits and maintenance logs, she noticed a recurring name. A contractor who had worked repeatedly on buildings in her block, his signature neat and deliberate. Nothing in itself unusual, but paired with the other small signs, it gave her pause. In the evenings, she began pacing the apartment more often, following small patterns. The way shadows shifted across the wall, the soft squeak of the heater, the hum of the refrigerator. Each sound seemed amplified, each scent more distinct. A faint tang of something metallic lingered in the kitchen, just enough to unsettle her without drawing attention from anyone else. One night, she ventured into the basement. The dim corridor smelled of damp concrete and rust. The building's pipes groaned overhead, sending vibrations through the floor. Near the old storage lockers, she noticed a lock slightly ajar. Inside, a piece of cloth had been draped carelessly over a box. She lifted it carefully. Beneath lay a pair of gloves, black leather, identical to the ones on her doorstep. She paused, heart tight. No note, no indication, just the gloves. The faint scent of antiseptic clung to them, almost pungent in the close air of the basement. She stepped back, letting the door fall gently into place. The basement was quiet again. The hum of the city above filtered through the floor, soft and distant. She traced a finger over her notebook, over all the threads, smudges, and scraps she had collected. Alone in the silence, she realized the story was spreading outward, small, subtle threads, almost imperceptible, weaving themselves into something she couldn't yet name. And yet, for the first time, she felt a strange sense of order in the chaos. Each clue, each object, each smell and mark seemed to pulse with a quiet insistence, as though waiting for her to follow. The following morning, she took a slow walk through the streets behind her apartment, the city still damp from the previous night's drizzle. The sidewalks glistened under the pale light of street lamps, and the soft hiss of tires on wet asphalt echoed faintly from the avenue below. She noticed details she'd never paid attention to before. The way a single leaf clung to a crack in the pavement, a faded sticker peeling from a lamppost, the faint scuff marks along the base of an otherwise clean wall. She paused outside a narrow, brick-fronted building she had passed countless times without a second glance. A small, hand-painted sign read "Repair and Supply." Inside, the window was fogged, and she could make out shapes of shelves stacked high with jars and boxes. Curiosity pressed her forward, and she pushed open the door, the bell above chiming softly. The scent of linseed oil and aged metal hit her immediately. A man appeared from the back, wiping his hands on a rag. He was older, with streaks of gray at his temples, and he looked at her carefully. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was low, measured. She hesitated, then asked if he had sold any gloves recently. Black, leather. His eyes flicked toward the cluttered shelves, but he shook his head slowly. "Not lately," he said. "You might try the market on Fifth. People trade unusual things there." Thanking him, she stepped back into the street. The air was cooler now, carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded her of the gloves and the thread she had found. She walked toward the old market district, a cluster of narrow streets where the buildings leaned slightly and neon signs buzzed faintly in the early evening. The market was quiet, more subdued than she expected. Wooden stalls were stacked with produce, jars, and odds and ends, the vendors' voices low and calm. She moved slowly, letting her gaze drift across the wares, the worn surfaces of tables, the flicker of light off tin cans and glass bottles. Near a stall selling secondhand tools, she noticed a small scrap of leather, frayed and black, tucked beneath a crate. She picked it up, pressing it between her fingers. The texture was familiar, and the faint antiseptic scent clung to it, just as it did to the gloves. Later, she stopped by a small bridge overlooking the river. Water flowed silently, dark and reflective under the street lamps. She rested her hands on the cold railing and noticed a tiny envelope tucked into the seam where the metal met the stone. She picked it up carefully, unfolding the thin paper inside. A single line was scrawled in neat handwriting. "Look closer where the light fades." Her pulse quickened, though her pace remained deliberate. She tucked the note into her coat pocket and lingered by the bridge for a while, noticing the subtle movements along the water's edge. A bird skimming the surface, the ripple of discarded leaves, the soft vibration of a passing boat in the distance. The next evening, she ventured into a small park across the river. It was nearly deserted, the paths slick with fallen leaves, the air smelling faintly of wet earth and decay. She followed a winding trail between trees, their branches heavy and low, brushing against her hair. At the edge of the park, near a patch of overgrown shrubs, she spotted a discarded shopping bag. Inside were a few items: a torn piece of cloth, a small, rusted key, and a fragment of black leather similar to the gloves. Back in her apartment, she laid everything across the counter: gloves, threads, scraps, the key, the note. She traced each object with her fingers, noting subtle similarities: the fold of the leather, the faint scent, the deliberate placement. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and damp metal, and even the flicker of the overhead light seemed sharper somehow. She began keeping a careful record of patterns, sketching maps of where she found each clue, noting the times of day and the ambient sounds. The distant hum of the city, the soft drip of water from the faucet, the occasional creak in the hallway, all became part of a larger rhythm she was beginning to understand. And while the pieces had not yet formed a clear picture, she felt a quiet anticipation, as if the city itself was guiding her through the small, deliberate breadcrumbs. Each night, as she set the objects in neat rows on her counter, she could almost feel the faint pulse of movement in the air, a reminder that someone had been there, moving through shadows and quiet spaces, leaving hints for her to follow. The morning air was damp and cool, carrying the faint scent of wet asphalt and decomposing leaves from the nearby trees. She walked deliberately, choosing streets she didn't usually take, passing rows of buildings with boarded-up windows and chipped paint. Every step seemed to echo softly against the quiet city, and she found herself scanning the edges of doorways, the corners of stoops, for anything unusual: a discarded wrapper, a small mark, the glint of metal hidden in shadow. She turned down a narrow alley she had never noticed before. Trash bins lined one side, their lids streaked with rust. The walls were mottled with old posters, peeling and curling at the edges. Near the end of the alley, she spotted a tiny piece of black thread caught on a protruding nail. It was delicate, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. She bent down and pinched it between her fingers, noting the faint scent, antiseptic, the same as the gloves. Curiosity drove her further along the alley, where it opened into a small, forgotten courtyard. The ground was uneven, cobblestones slick with moisture. A single lamppost flickered, casting a narrow cone of light across a wooden bench. On the bench, a notebook lay open, pages splayed to the wind. She approached slowly, the leather gloves in her coat pocket. The notebook was blank except for a faint smudge of red ink on one page. She touched it lightly, and the ink left a small mark on her fingertip. Later, she stopped at a tiny cafe tucked into a corner near the river. The bell above the door tinkled softly as she entered. The interior was warm and quiet, smelling faintly of coffee and toasted bread. She ordered a tea, and while waiting, she noticed a small, folded piece of paper on the edge of the counter. She picked it up carefully. It was blank, save for a single, curved indentation, as if someone had pressed a finger against it in haste. She left the cafe with the paper tucked into her notebook and wandered along the riverbank. The water was dark and smooth, reflecting the faint glow of distant streetlights. A bridge loomed ahead, old and rusted, its iron railing streaked with greenish oxidation. Near one of the support beams, she noticed a small scratch in the metal, shallow but deliberate. She pressed her gloved finger to it, feeling a faint warmth in the metal under her touch, though no one was near. As dusk fell, she returned to her apartment, moving slowly through the quiet building. The stairwell was cooler than usual, the smell of damp concrete sharp in her nose. On the landing outside her door, she noticed a small, folded envelope tucked beneath the mat. She picked it up carefully. Inside was a single key, rusted but intact, and a tiny scrap of paper with numbers written in a neat, looping hand. No explanation. Inside her apartment, she spread out the gloves, the threads, the scraps, the key, the note. She traced each item with her fingers, noting their textures, their subtle imperfections. The faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, almost like a whisper. She realized she had begun mapping the movements of someone she could neither see nor identify. Each trace, thread, smear, scratch, folded paper, was a signal, almost imperceptible, pointing towards something she did not yet understand. Night settled over the city, soft and muted. She sat by the window, notebook open, sketching the alleyways, the courtyard, the riverbank. Outside, distant sirens hummed low, and the faint creak of a door in her building made her flinch. The objects on her counter caught the pale light from the street lamp. Gloves, key, scraps, threads, all silent witnesses. And though she did not know it yet, every subtle mark, every discarded scrap, every fleeting scent was part of a deliberate pattern, a quiet thread stretching through the city. She felt it in her chest, a faint, insistent pulse that kept her alert, that whispered for her to keep following, keep noticing, keep uncovering. The next morning, she took the long way to the grocery store. Moving through streets she rarely walked. The sidewalks were slick with dew, and the faint smell of damp concrete and exhaust hung in the air. She passed a small, abandoned playground where the swings swayed slightly in the wind. A thin layer of fog clung to the ground, curling around the metal slides and the rubberized matting. She knelt briefly to examine a small piece of black thread tangled in the chain of one swing. Coarse, almost invisible unless you looked closely. After the store, she wandered into an older part of the neighborhood, where the buildings leaned close to one another and the windows were streaked with age. She noticed a narrow courtyard between two apartment blocks, half hidden behind a rusted gate. The brick walls were mottled with dark stains, the kind that suggested years of rainwater running unevenly down the surface. She stepped through carefully, her shoes crunching on the scattered gravel. In one corner, a small puddle reflected the dim morning light. She leaned closer and saw a tiny smear of red along the edge, barely perceptible, like someone had pressed a fingertip into the water and lifted it again. Later, she stopped at a laundromat she had passed countless times but never entered. Inside, the machines hummed softly, the air warm and slightly perfumed with detergent. She leaned against the counter, letting her gaze drift across the rows of washers and dryers. One dryer door had a faint scratch along the metal rim, just noticeable enough to catch her attention. She pressed her finger to it, feeling a faint residue, a metallic tang that reminded her of the gloves. The clerk, a man with tired eyes, glanced at her but said nothing, returning to sorting clothes. That evening, she found herself walking along the river again. The surface was dark, smooth, almost mirror-like, disturbed only by occasional ripples from the current. Near an old boathouse, she noticed a small, folded piece of paper wedged between two boards in the dock. She pulled it free gently. It was blank, but the edges were worn and softened, as if it had been handled repeatedly. A faint scent lingered on it, leather and antiseptic. Back in her apartment, she laid the items across the counter: gloves, threads, scraps, the key, the paper from the dock. She traced the surfaces with her fingers, noting their textures, subtle imperfections, and the faint odors clinging to each. Outside, the city hummed softly, distant traffic low and muffled, occasional footsteps echoing in the hall. She traced her notebook across the counter, sketching rough maps of the locations she had visited, marking where she had found each clue, the time, and the conditions. Later, curiosity led her to the small, neglected cemetery on the edge of the neighborhood. The gates were rusty, the grass overgrown, gravestones leaning at odd angles. She walked slowly among the rows, noting the dates and names, the small flowers left by recent visitors. At the far edge, near a crumbling wall, she found a tiny, carved indentation in the stone, a shallow line, almost like a finger had pressed and dragged across the surface. She knelt and pressed her glove to it. A faint dust rose, clinging to the leather. The smell was faint but familiar, antiseptic mixed with stone and earth. When she returned home, she set the gloves, key, scraps, threads, and now the stone dust across the counter. She lit a small lamp, its warm glow catching the textures of each object, the subtle differences between them. The room felt alive with quiet tension, each item a silent witness to movements and choices she couldn't yet fully understand. Night settled over the city, soft and quiet. She sat by the window, notebook in hand, tracing connections between alleys, docks, playgrounds, laundromats, and the cemetery. Outside, the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional creak of the building's pipes underscored the silence. The pattern was still incomplete, but she felt the edges of it forming, a network of subtle signs, small and deliberate, waiting for her to follow. And though she didn't know what it all meant, she could feel it. Someone had been leaving breadcrumbs, small, almost imperceptible, each one a deliberate choice, each one waiting for her to notice. The anticipation settled into her chest, steady and insistent, urging her to continue. The next afternoon, she walked along a side street lined with shuttered storefronts. The air was sharp with the scent of rain that had not yet fully dried, carrying hints of oil and wet asphalt. A single crow moved across the rooftops above, cawing briefly before disappearing behind the chimneys. Her steps slowed as she noticed the faint scuff of something dark along the edge of a doorway. Just a shadow, really, until she crouched and saw a tiny fragment of black leather wedged in the crack. She pressed it between her fingers. The familiar antiseptic tang lingered in the air. She continued, drawn almost unconsciously toward an old, disused tram stop at the end of the street. The metal shelter was rusted, the glass panels streaked and cracked. Beneath the bench, she spotted a small scrap of paper, folded and dampened by the morning dew. Unfolding it carefully, she found a faint, looping symbol pressed into the page. A partial impression, as if something had been stamped and then lifted away. She tucked it into her notebook alongside the threads, scraps, and the key, tracing it lightly with a fingertip. Later, she wandered into the public library, a quiet building with high ceilings and polished wooden floors. The faint smell of old books and dust filled her nose. She moved deliberately through the stacks, scanning the edges of shelves, the corners where books leaned unevenly. On a lower shelf near the back, a small, blackened piece of paper stuck out from the spine of a discarded volume. It bore a smudge of red ink, slightly sticky to the touch, almost like a fingerprint pressed hastily. She placed it in her notebook, noting its location carefully. As evening fell, she crossed the bridge over the river, lingering near the old ferry dock. The water was dark and still, reflecting the dim glow of nearby street lamps. A rowboat rocked gently against the mooring posts. On one post, she noticed a thin scrape in the wood, running horizontally, faint but deliberate. She traced it with her gloved finger, feeling the rough texture beneath the smooth leather. A faint metallic scent rose from the wood, mingling with the river's damp smell. Returning home, she walked slowly through the stairwell, pausing on the landing to examine the scuffed marks along the walls again. She traced them with a gloved hand, noticing a faint ridge that hadn't been there before, subtle enough to be easily missed. Inside her apartment, she laid the gloves, scraps, key, threads, and new pieces from the tram stop and dock across the counter. She adjusted the lamp, letting its warm light illuminate each object, highlighting the textures, faint stains, and impressions. That night, she wandered into the small, overgrown garden behind her building. The path was narrow, lined with weeds, and the stone edging was slick with dew. Near the edge, a piece of paper had caught on the branch of a low bush. She retrieved it carefully. The paper was blank, but she noticed a faint crease forming a subtle pattern, like a barely visible trail. She pressed it into her notebook, alongside all the other clues, and lingered in the garden, listening to the soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves. She returned inside and arranged the items again, moving each slightly, noting the spaces between them, the angles at which shadows fell. The room smelled faintly of leather, damp paper, and antiseptic. She traced connections in her mind, drawing lines between alleys, tram stops, docks, gardens, and stairwells. Nothing made sense yet, but the pattern was growing, subtle and deliberate, like a map invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. And through the quiet of her apartment, she felt the presence of someone else in the city, moving, leaving traces, small and careful, always just out of sight. Each night, each small discovery made her pulse steady, her attention sharper, her curiosity insistent. The trail was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and she knew she would follow it, step by careful step, until it revealed itself. The following morning, She left her apartment later than usual, the sky heavy with low clouds, the kind that muted colors and flattened shadows. She wandered toward an old, narrow street lined with buildings whose brickwork had begun to crumble at the edges. The sidewalk was uneven, damp in places, and the faint smell of wet stone mingled with exhaust from cars idling a block away. Near the corner, a small hardware shop caught her attention. Its windows were fogged, and the faint glow of a single overhead bulb illuminated a cluttered interior. She stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly. The air smelled of sawdust and rust. A man, wiry with sharp eyes, emerged from the back, wiping his hands on a rag. She asked quietly if anyone had left or sold black leather gloves recently. He shook his head slowly, but his gaze lingered on her hands as she rested them in her coat pockets. Exiting the shop, she moved toward a small, forgotten square tucked between two apartment blocks. The ground was cobbled, uneven, and damp, with leaves scattered in small puddles. A low wall along one edge was covered in moss, and she noticed a faint scratch near the base, a shallow line just visible beneath the grime. She pressed her gloved finger against it, feeling the texture, tracing the faint indentation carefully. Later, she wandered into a quiet bookshop that smelled faintly of old paper and waxed floors. She ran her fingers along the spines, pausing occasionally, and noticed a single volume slightly out of place. Pulling it gently, a small scrap of black leather fell to the floor. She retrieved it, tucking it into her notebook, noting the faint smell of antiseptic lingering in its fibers. As dusk fell, she moved along the riverbank, taking the narrower paths where the light dimmed and the sounds of the city faded. Old boats rocked gently at their moorings, the water smooth and dark. Along the edge, a rusted bollard caught her attention. Near its base, she spotted a faint red smear, small, deliberate. She traced it carefully, letting her fingertip linger on the rough metal. The metallic scent mingled with the river's dampness, faint but distinct. Returning home, she paused in the stairwell, noticing the subtle shift of shadows along the walls, the faint creak of pipes overhead. On the landing outside her door, a small folded envelope had appeared. Inside was a tiny brass key, tarnished but intact, and a scrap of paper with a single number scrawled in neat, looping handwriting. She laid it alongside the gloves, threads, scraps, and papers already on the counter, letting the lamp cast its warm light across the items. Later that night, curiosity drew her to a narrow, overgrown alley behind her building. The path was damp, lined with weeds, and the stone edging slick underfoot. At the far end, a small, broken crate rested against a wall. Inside, she found a piece of paper, blank except for a faint crease running diagonally across it. She pressed it gently into her notebook, feeling the subtle texture, noting the way the light caught the fold. She spent hours arranging the items on her counter, moving them slightly, studying the shadows and angles. Each object, the gloves, threads, scraps, keys, papers, and small fragments, seemed to hum with quiet intention. The air in the apartment carried the faint scent of leather, antiseptic, and damp paper, and the distant hum of traffic filtered softly through the windows. And in that quiet, she could almost feel the presence of another, moving through the city, leaving careful traces, small and deliberate, always just out of reach. Each night, each discovery added a pulse to the pattern she was slowly beginning to recognize. Though she could not yet understand its meaning, she knew it demanded attention, patience, and careful observation. The trail was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and she would follow it. The next morning, she walked through the quiet streets before the city fully woke, her footsteps muffled against damp pavement. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves and distant exhaust. She passed a narrow passageway between two apartment blocks she had rarely noticed before. The brick walls leaned close, moss darkening the lower courses, and a faint line of red smeared along a cornerstone caught her attention. She knelt, tracing it lightly with her gloved finger. It was small, almost imperceptible, but deliberate, drawn by a vague sense of direction rather than conscious thought. She followed the passage to a forgotten courtyard behind an old bakery. The cobblestones were uneven and slick, and the air smelled faintly of yeast and damp wood. Near a bench tucked under a vine-covered trellis, she found a scrap of black leather, soft but frayed at the edges. She picked it up, noting the faint antiseptic scent clinging to it. Later, she wandered into a quiet antique shop along the riverfront. The air inside was warm, tinged with dust and varnish. Shelves were crowded with old trinkets, porcelain, and glass, all catching the muted light from the windows. As she browsed, she noticed a small box on a lower shelf, its lid slightly ajar. Inside, a torn piece of paper rested flat, marked with a single, almost imperceptible smudge of red ink. She pressed it into her notebook alongside threads, scraps, and the other papers she had collected. As evening fell, she crossed a narrow footbridge to a small island park she had never visited. The paths were lined with low shrubs and worn stone benches. Mist clung to the ground, curling between the roots of the trees. At the edge of the path, a rusted lamppost flickered faintly. Beneath it, a tiny brass key lay partially buried in the damp soil. She bent down and retrieved it carefully, noting its tarnished surface and the subtle scratches along its edges. Returning home, she paused on the stairwell landing, listening to the faint hum of the building and the occasional creak of a pipe. On her door, she noticed the slight tilt of the peephole cover, a small detail she hadn't observed before. Inside, she laid the gloves, threads, scraps, keys, and papers across the counter, arranging them with care. The soft glow of her lamp illuminated the textures and faint stains of each object. The air smelled faintly of leather, paper, and antiseptic, layering the room with an almost tangible tension. Later, curiosity led her to the basement of her building. The air was damp and heavy, smelling of concrete and rust. She moved along the corridor slowly, her shoes scuffing lightly against the floor. At the far end, an old storage locker had a small, triangular scratch along its door, barely noticeable. She pressed her gloved hand against it, feeling the faint roughness beneath the leather. Inside, a scrap of black leather had been tucked under a loose floorboard, and she retrieved it carefully, noting the familiar antiseptic scent. Back in her apartment, she arranged everything again, moving the pieces slightly to study shadows and angles. The city outside hummed softly, the distant traffic and occasional footsteps echoing faintly. She traced lines between the alleys, courtyards, footbridges, shops, parks, and basements in her notebook, marking times and locations. In the quiet of her room, she felt the presence of another in the city, someone deliberate, careful, leaving faint signals through the spaces she moved in. Each mark, each scrap, each key and thread was part of a silent rhythm. The trail was subtle, almost invisible, yet persistent, and she knew she would follow it, step by cautious step, through the muted streets and shadowed corners, until it revealed itself. The next morning, She left her apartment with the gloves tucked into her coat pocket. Walking along streets she thought she knew well. The air was sharp with the scent of damp asphalt and wet stone, faintly metallic under the pale sunlight. She passed an old clock tower at the edge of the neighborhood, its hands frozen at 7:15, and paused to run her fingers along the rough masonry. A tiny groove, just wide enough for a fingertip, ran along the edge of one stone. She pressed lightly, feeling the faint scrape of something embedded, black leather, worn and fraying. Curiosity led her to a narrow cobblestone street lined with shuttered apartments. A stray cat darted between shadows, brushing against her ankles. At the corner, a small cafe had its door propped open. Inside, the smell of coffee and warm bread mixed with the faint tang of cleaning solution. She lingered near the window, noticing a chair slightly out of place, its leg resting atop a tiny scrap of paper. She retrieved it, a folded corner, damp from morning condensation, with a faint smudge of red along the edge. She pressed it into her notebook, tracing it gently with her fingertip. Later, she wandered into a small, dimly lit tailor's shop tucked between two taller buildings. The air smelled of fabric and dye, muted sunlight filtering through dusty windows. On the counter, a partially open drawer revealed a piece of black leather, soft and faintly antiseptic. She picked it up, noting the subtle crease along its surface and the way the light caught its texture. As dusk fell, she made her way to the edge of the old industrial district, a labyrinth of narrow alleys and shuttered warehouses. The faint hum of distant machinery and occasional creak of metal filled the quiet. She noticed a faint streak of red along the corner of a brick wall, just at eye level. Kneeling, she traced it lightly with a gloved hand, feeling the slight roughness beneath her fingertips. Near it, a loose screw protruded from the wall, the head worn and scratched, as though it had been touched repeatedly. Returning home, she lingered in the stairwell, listening to the subtle echoes of the building, the faint drip of water from the pipes, the soft scuff of her shoes, the distant hum of the street outside. On the landing outside her door, a small envelope lay neatly tucked against the baseboard. Inside was a tiny brass key, its surface worn and tarnished, along with a slip of paper with a single number written in precise, looping handwriting. She added it to the growing arrangement on her counter, alongside gloves, threads, scraps, papers, and keys, letting the lamp illuminate each object carefully. Later that night, she wandered to a quiet park on the far side of the river. The paths were narrow, lined with low shrubs and worn benches, the ground slick with dew. Mist clung to the edges of the grass, curling between roots and stones. Beneath a lamppost that flickered intermittently, she found a small scrap of black leather caught in the roots of a bush. She retrieved it carefully, noting the familiar antiseptic scent. Back in her apartment, she arranged the items again, studying the subtle differences between them. The fraying of the leather, the faint smudge of red, the slight tarnish of the keys. She traced lines between the alleys, courtyards, parks, bridges, cafes, and basements in her notebook, marking times and conditions for each discovery. Through the quiet of her apartment, she could almost sense the movement of another in the city, deliberate, careful, leaving faint, deliberate signals across spaces she moved through. Each discovery, small and almost imperceptible, was part of a larger pattern she had not yet fully understood. And in the stillness, she felt a quiet insistence, urging her to keep noticing, keep tracing, and keep following the faint trail through the city's shadows. The following morning, she took a different route, guided by an almost unconscious pull toward streets she rarely walked. The sidewalks were slick with dew, and the air smelled faintly of wet stone and earth, carrying a metallic tang that made her pause. She moved slowly, noticing cracks in the pavement, the faint scuff of shoes on the wet surface, the way a single leaf clung to the edge of a gutter. She turned down a narrow lane that opened onto a small, overlooked courtyard behind a row of older apartment buildings. The bricks were streaked dark with age, and a low fountain in the center was dry, its basin cracked and empty. Near the fountain's edge, she noticed a thin piece of black thread tangled among moss and grit. She picked it up, letting the scent of antiseptic cling lightly to her fingers, and tucked it carefully into her notebook. Drawn further, she passed a shuttered locksmith shop with a cracked window, the glass reflecting muted sunlight. Inside, a collection of keys hung on hooks behind the counter, some tarnished, some new. She didn't enter, but noticed one key on the display slightly bent at its tip, almost imperceptible unless examined closely. Her pulse quickened at the detail, though she had no immediate explanation for its significance. Later, she wandered along a deserted riverside path, the water moving silently, smooth and dark. Old mooring posts leaned slightly to one side, rotted at the base. Between two posts, she found a small scrap of paper, folded and dampened by the morning mist. She unfolded it carefully, seeing faint impressions of numbers pressed into the surface, barely visible to the naked eye. She pressed it into her notebook and lingered, listening to the subtle lapping of water against the wooden posts and the occasional hiss of distant traffic. As the afternoon waned, she made her way into a tiny flower shop tucked between two taller buildings. The air smelled faintly of soil and cut blooms. She traced the edges of the counter and shelves, noticing a small black leather fragment wedged beneath a pot of soil, the antiseptic scent faint but present. She retrieved it and held it gently, noting the subtle wear in the leather and the curve of its frayed edges. Returning home, she paused on the stairwell, studying the faint scuffs and marks along the walls. The building was quiet, the usual hum of distant traffic muted. On the landing outside her door, a small, unmarked envelope rested against the baseboard. Inside was a tiny brass key, tarnished, along with a scrap of paper marked with faint, looping numbers. She laid it alongside the gloves, threads, scraps, and other fragments across the counter, arranging them carefully under the warm glow of the lamp. Later, curiosity drew her to an old, overgrown park near the edge of the city. Narrow paths wound between low shrubs and moss-covered stones. She moved slowly, her shoes soft against the damp ground, listening to the occasional rustle of leaves. Beneath a flickering lamppost, a piece of black leather lay half buried in the roots of a tree. She retrieved it carefully, noting the familiar antiseptic scent and subtle crease along its surface. Back in her apartment, she spread out the collected items again, studying each texture, the faint smudges, the fraying, the tarnish, the impressions. She traced connections between streets, courtyards, river paths, shops, and parks in her notebook, marking time, location, and subtle conditions for each discovery. The quiet of her apartment felt almost alive with the presence of someone else moving deliberately through the city, leaving faint signals, subtle and deliberate, always just beyond her immediate reach. Each scrap, thread, key, and paper formed part of a rhythm she could feel but not yet fully understand. She traced lines and patterns in her mind, her pulse steady, her attention keen, aware that the trail was still unfolding, small and deliberate. waiting for her to follow each step carefully. The morning air was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of wet leaves and distant exhaust. She left her apartment later than usual, her gloved hands tucked into the pockets of her coat, moving deliberately through streets that felt quieter than normal. She passed an old stationery shop with peeling paint and a cracked window. A faint flicker of movement inside caught her eye, though when she stepped closer, nothing was there, just the faint scent of paper and glue. She turned down a narrow lane, barely wide enough for a car, the walls on either side streaked with age and moss. Near the edge of a doorway, she noticed a small, triangular scratch in the stone, shallow but deliberate. Kneeling, she traced it lightly with her gloved finger, feeling the roughness beneath the leather. A faint metallic scent hung in the air, faintly antiseptic. Further along, she found herself at a neglected courtyard behind a row of apartment buildings. The cobblestones were slick from overnight moisture, and a broken fountain lay in the center, its basin dry and cracked. Beneath the fountain's edge, a small scrap of black leather had caught on a jagged stone. She picked it up carefully, noting the fraying along the edges and the faint smell of antiseptic that clung to it. Later, curiosity led her to a tiny, dimly lit corner cafe she had never entered. The air smelled faintly of coffee, warm bread, and cleaning solution. She lingered near the counter, observing the worn floorboards and the faint scuff marks left by chairs. A folded scrap of paper had slipped between the counter and the wall. She retrieved it, blank except for a faint indentation, like someone had pressed a finger hard into the page and lifted it again. As evening approached, she wandered along the river, where the water was dark and still, reflecting the dim glow of streetlights. Old mooring posts leaned slightly, rotted at the base, and a wooden plank, loose and weathered, caught her attention. Beneath it lay a small brass key, tarnished and scratched along its edge. She retrieved it carefully, letting the scent of metal and faint antiseptic rise to her nose. Returning home, she paused in the stairwell, listening to the building's quiet hum, the soft drip of water from the pipes, the faint creak of the old floorboards, the distant murmur of traffic. On her landing, a small, unmarked envelope rested against the baseboard. Inside was a folded scrap of paper, faintly creased, with a single number written in neat, looping handwriting. She laid it alongside the gloves, threads, scraps, papers, and keys across the counter, letting the lamp illuminate the textures and faint stains of each object. Later, she wandered into a small, overgrown park she had only glimpsed from the street. Narrow paths wound between low shrubs and moss-covered stones. Mist clung to the ground, curling between the roots of the trees. Beneath a flickering lamppost, a piece of black leather lay half-buried in the soil. She retrieved it gently, noting the familiar antiseptic scent and subtle crease along its surface. Back in her apartment, she spread the items again, moving them slightly to examine shadows, textures, and angles. She traced lines between alleyways, courtyards, cafes, riverside docks, and parks in her notebook, marking time, location, and subtle conditions for each discovery. The quiet of the room felt alive with anticipation. She could sense the presence of someone else in the city, moving deliberately, leaving subtle signals and traces across the space as she walked. Each scrap, thread, key, and paper formed part of a rhythm she could feel but not yet fully understand. She traced connections in her mind, her pulse steady, her attention keen, aware that the trail was still unfolding, delicate, deliberate, waiting for her to notice the smallest details and follow each step carefully. Over the following days, she moved with a quiet purpose through the city, retracing her steps, visiting the same alleyways, courtyards, and riverside paths. Each piece of the puzzle she had gathered began to align, not in a sudden flash, but as a series of subtle, quiet realizations. The scraps of leather, the faint red smudges, the brass keys, the folded papers, they were not random. They traced a path, a rhythm of presence and absence that pointed toward one constant. Someone had been leaving deliberate, small markers, guiding her attention, but never intruding directly. It was in the courtyard behind the old bakery that the connection first settled clearly in her mind. The triangular scratch in the stone, the tiny smear of red along the fountain's edge, the fragment of black leather. All of it bore the same faint antiseptic scent. She remembered the locks, the bent key in the locksmith's display, the brass keys at the river's edge. They were not threats, she realized. They were signatures, deliberate but careful, marking a trail of attention that was almost intimate in its precision. Someone had been watching, yes, but with restraint rather than malice, noting her routines, her paths, her quiet observations. The papers were the final piece. The impressions, the subtle creases, the single numbers, they were references to locations, small coordinates in her city that tied the scattered pieces together. She traced them in her notebook, overlaying maps of the streets and parks she had walked, and at last a pattern emerged. The markers led from her apartment to the library, the abandoned courtyard, the river docks, the parks, and back again. They formed a loop, not random, not chaotic. Someone was mapping the city through her footsteps, quietly observing, subtly prompting her awareness. And then she understood why. In the quiet of her apartment, surrounded by the collection of gloves, scraps, threads, keys, and papers, she saw the intention behind it all. It was not a game, not a threat, it was guidance. Someone had discovered her work, her attention to detail, her habit of noticing the almost imperceptible. They had left signs, small but deliberate, to direct her toward an understanding they themselves had pieced together long ago. The patterns of forgotten spaces in the city, the overlooked details in alleys, parks, and courtyards, the small markers that go unnoticed by almost everyone. It was a revelation that settled gently, without urgency. There was no confrontation, no sudden danger. The city continued around her, traffic humming softly, streetlights flickering, the river lapping quietly against the docks. The traces she had followed, the subtle signals she had observed, all fit into a quiet, deliberate order. Someone had shared it with her slowly, carefully, trusting her attention and her patience. In the days that followed, she walked her usual paths with a calm awareness, noticing details she had never seen before. A slight scrape on a lamppost, a thread caught in a grate, the curve of a stone where rainwater had run unevenly. Each was a quiet confirmation of the pattern she had unraveled, a silent acknowledgement of the presence that had guided her. She understood it now, the careful choreography of observation, restraint, and subtle communication. At last, she gathered the gloves, scraps, threads, keys, and papers into a small box, placing it on her counter one final time. The items carried no menace, only the faint, antiseptic scent and the memory of careful intention. She lit a single lamp and traced the arrangements one last time, letting the city's distant hum settle through the room. The trail had ended where it needed to, in quiet understanding. The mystery had not exploded into drama. nor had it demanded a sudden revelation. Instead, it had unraveled in small, deliberate steps through observation, patience, and reflection. She could feel the presence that had guided her, not as a threat, but as a careful, watchful acknowledgement of her awareness. She turned from the counter, leaving the box where it sat, and moved to the window. The city stretched before her, soft and muted in evening light, each alley, courtyard, and riverside path carrying its quiet secrets. For the first time, she walked through it with a gentle calm, fully aware of the subtle traces, the careful signs, and the invisible connections. The city felt both larger and more intimate, full of small mysteries she could notice, understand, and respect. And in that quiet, reflective calm, the case finally felt complete, not with confrontation or revelation, but with the steady, unhurried acknowledgement of truth. The pattern had been laid, the trail had been followed, and the understanding settled gently, like the soft closing of a door in a quiet, lived-in room. Case 2. A commuter train was expected to sit in maintenance. Surveillance showed it had reversed out of the siding. The brake handles were slightly worn in positions inconsistent with normal service checks. The station yard smelled faintly of oil and rain-damp steel. Puddles reflected the overhead lamps in soft, broken patterns, and the distant rhythm of a train bell echoed through the tracks, almost as if measuring time itself. Inspector Hale walked along the edge of the maintenance siding, his shoes squelching against the gritty concrete. He paused near a coil of hose lying discarded, its surface sticky from some unknown residue, and crouched to examine it. A small smear of grease, streaked with a pale, almost iridescent tint, clung to the rubber. He touched it lightly with a gloved finger, noting the slight tackiness, then wiped it carefully onto a sample card. Inside the maintenance shed, the smell of oil was heavier, mingled with the faint tang of cleaning solvents. A bench nearby had several pairs of gloves tossed carelessly. One pair seemed newer than the rest, almost pristine, except for a faint smear along the cuff. Hale flexed his fingers slowly, remembering the inconsistent were on the train's brake handles. It was subtle, a matter of positioning and pressure, too precise to be accidental, too uneven to be routine. A clerk in a faded orange safety vest glanced up from a clipboard. "Nothing unusual," he murmured, eyes darting toward the train as it rested at an angle slightly off the standard marking. Hale didn't reply immediately, instead noting the way the fluorescent lights flickered across the chipped paint of the train's exterior, casting shadows that shifted with the slight sway of the metal. Walking around the train, Hale observed scratches along the undercarriage, shallow but irregular, almost like someone had knelt there to reach a panel. The metal felt cold under his fingertips, carrying the faint vibrations of distant engines. Near the coupling, he noticed tiny flecks of red-brown rust mingled with what appeared to be a fine dust of some other material. He crouched, leaning closer, the smell of iron sharp in his nose. In a quiet corner of the yard, a small office sat partially open. Papers littered the floor in disarray. A pencil rolled gently across the linoleum when a draft shifted through a cracked window. Hale bent to pick it up, and the edge of a folded note slipped from beneath a ledger. The handwriting was neat, almost clinical, with a single line crossed out twice. He slid it into a pocket for later, not yet reading, sensing it might connect with the strange patterns he'd noted on the brake handles. Outside, the night air carried the scent of wet asphalt and faint smoke from a distant heater. A pigeon shuffled along the edge of a puddle, pecking at something small and metallic. Hale watched it for a moment, realizing how few normal, unnoticed details could exist in the midst of something irregular. The birds' quiet activity, the ripple of rainwater, the occasional distant rumble, all of it formed a subtle rhythm, like the background hum of a secret yet unspoken. Returning to the train, Hale knelt again near the wheel assemblies. Tiny scratches ran along the steel in patterns that suggested a specific motion, deliberate but cautious. He traced them slowly with gloved fingers, feeling the shallow grooves under the pads. Somewhere in the distance, a door clanged shut, startling him briefly, and then the sound of a slow, deliberate footstep echoed on concrete. He turned. No one was there. Only the faint echo of movement, a reminder that the space itself could hold secrets in its empty corners. Hale's eyes lingered on a small hatch near the front of the train. It had been tampered with recently. The locking pins were slightly misaligned, though nothing had been fully forced open. The hinges bore a thin film of oil that had collected dust along the edges. He ran a gloved finger along it, noting the contrast between old grime and the newer smudge. He straightened, letting the tension settle along his shoulders, aware of how quiet the yard had become, each sound now distinct, deliberate. Near the shed exit, a vending machine hummed, its fluorescent panel flickering in time with Hale's own thoughts. A half-empty bottle of water rattled slightly inside when the machine shifted. He listened to the subtle vibrations, the faint metallic echo of coins inside. Everything felt connected. The brake handles, the small smears, the shifted papers, the scratches, even the wet weight of the night air pressing down. Hale exhaled slowly, knowing he was still far from understanding what had happened, but aware that the story was gradually revealing itself in the smallest of movements, in the quiet, almost invisible traces left behind. He walked along the edge of the siding again, footsteps soft, eyes catching the glint of metal embedded in a puddle. The train sat motionless, but the details around it, every mark, smear, and displaced object, felt like pieces of a puzzle whose edges he could only begin to trace. And somewhere, beyond the reach of light and sound, the subtle rhythm of the night seemed to whisper that the next discovery would come not with a bang, but with a careful, almost imperceptible shift in what had been overlooked. Hale stepped off the edge of the siding and followed the narrow service path that ran behind the maintenance shed. Gravel crunched softly underfoot, damp and cold from the night's drizzle. Along the fence, coils of cable leaned against rusted posts, their ends frayed and tangled. A faint metallic tang hung in the air, mixed with the smell of wet concrete and old grease. He knelt briefly, brushing a line of dirt from one of the cables, noticing a thin streak of what looked like oil, darker than the rest, almost glossy. He traced it with a fingertip, following it toward a small door in the wall, one that led to an unused storage room. Inside, dust motes floated in the narrow beam of his flashlight. Cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly, some torn along the edges, revealing cables, tools, and gloves of different sizes. One box had been shifted recently, its corners pressed into the floor in a way that suggested someone had knelt or crouched there. Hale crouched, sliding his hand across the floor and feeling the faint impression of a shoe sole. The tread was worn, but not uniformly. Someone had moved carefully, almost deliberately, leaving a pattern that caught his attention. A soft click echoed somewhere in the far corner, and he paused, listening. A small metal cabinet door had swung slightly, revealing a set of keys dangling from a hook. They were arranged neatly, each labeled, though one label had been scratched almost entirely off. Hale touched the metal, cool, dry, and lifted the key, turning it gently in his hand. The tag was almost illegible, something like Siding 3B, the letters faint. He tucked it into his pocket and stood slowly, the flashlight catching the edge of a dusty window streaked with condensation. Outside, the yard looked different from this angle. Shadows stretched across the gravel, and he could see the faint outline of the train resting, larger, more imposing in the distance. He returned to the siding, noticing a small puddle where oil had collected in a shallow dip in the concrete. Hale knelt again, observing tiny scratches at its edge, almost like the residue of something dragged. He swirled the water gently with a gloved finger, noting the way particles floated briefly before settling. There was a subtle smell, burnt rubber, faint, almost imperceptible. It reminded him of tires sliding against wet rails. A security guard passed along the far end of the yard, silhouetted against the glow of another building. Hale nodded to him quietly. The guard paused, shifting a flashlight from hand to hand, then muttered, "Nothing unusual so far. Just the usual mess." Hale's eyes drifted to the ground near the guard's boots. A paper clip, bent and tarnished, lay half buried in gravel. He picked it up with a gloved finger, noting the tiny scratch along its curve. It was insignificant, almost, but it added to the feeling that someone had been here recently, moving carefully, leaving only the faintest traces behind. Hale's attention was drawn to the fence along the far side of the yard. There, someone had wedged a small panel open, the edges chipped. He crouched, peering through the gap into a narrow alley beyond the yard. It smelled of damp brick, faint mildew, and faint chemical undertones he couldn't immediately place. A faint scuff mark led along the alley, partially washed by rain, disappearing near a pile of discarded pallets. Hale traced it with his eyes slowly, the rhythm of the movement steady, almost meditative. From the alley, a soft scrape echoed, a pallet shifting, settling against the wall. Hale moved closer, the gravel crunching beneath him, careful not to disturb anything. Between the pallets, he glimpsed a small toolbox. Its lid was scratched along the edge, as though it had been opened and closed quickly. He crouched, brushing dust from it and running a gloved hand over the surface. The paint was chipped in one corner, revealing bare metal, and a faint residue clung there, reddish-brown in tone. Not blood, he thought at first, but it carried the metallic tang that lingered in the air across the yard. A nearby drain hummed faintly with water movement. Hale paused to listen, crouched at the edge. Something glinted near the grate, a tiny fragment, reflective in the flashlight beam. He reached for it and realized it was a shard of glass, oddly clean amidst the grime. He turned it over in his gloved fingers, noting the jagged edge and a tiny streak of something almost imperceptibly dark. It caught the light in a way that made the shard look like it held a memory of the night itself. As he straightened, Hale's eyes fell on a faint light moving behind the maintenance building. He approached quietly, stepping over cables and puddles, listening. A door opened and closed softly, metal against metal, and he caught the smell of freshly burned paper. Near the door, a stack of folders had been knocked slightly askew. Hale knelt and ran a gloved hand across the top one, noting the way it felt smooth along the edges, but worn in patches from repeated handling. A few pages bore annotations in pencil, neat and deliberate, some numbers and letters underlined twice, almost as though someone were leaving a breadcrumb trail for themselves. He stood slowly, feeling the weight of observation, of details collected but not yet understood. Outside, the alley lay quiet, puddles reflecting distant lamps. The train still rested in the siding, indifferent to the tiny disturbances around it. And Hale knew that each small discovery, the scratches, the smudges, the faint odors, the misaligned panels, was part of a slow, careful story being told in silence. He walked back along the edge of the yard, senses alert, aware that the next clue could appear anywhere, under a pile of debris, behind a door, in a corner no one noticed. And each would draw him further into the quiet, unhurried tension of the unfolding investigation. Hale left the alley, letting the soft sound of rain dripping from the eaves guide him toward the older section of the yard. Here, the ground was uneven, patches of moss and weeds pushing up between cracked concrete slabs. A thin layer of water had collected in the depressions, reflecting the pale yellow glow of a solitary lamp mounted high on a rusted post. He crouched to examine one puddle, noticing faint streaks of dirt that weren't consistent with natural runoff. Someone had dragged something through here recently, careful not to leave much behind. A narrow passage led between two storage buildings. The air smelled faintly of oil and old wood, mingling with the dampness. Hale ran his gloved fingers along the edge of a weathered crate leaning against the wall. The surface was rough, splintered in places, and a small smear of reddish-brown clung near one corner. He traced it gently, noting how it seemed out of place among the otherwise clean, dry surface. A door at the end of the passage creaked when he nudged it with his shoulder. Inside was a room lit only by a single bare bulb, swinging slightly, casting elongated shadows across the floor. Dust floated in the air, catching in the beam of his flashlight. On a low workbench, tools lay scattered, but one in particular drew his attention. A pair of pliers, the handles worn in a pattern that didn't match ordinary use. A faint residue clung to the metal, streaked in the direction of repeated gripping. Hale lifted them carefully, feeling the weight, the slight stickiness under his fingers. Near the corner of the room, a stack of boxes had shifted, revealing a narrow gap between them and the wall. Hale crouched, peering in. A piece of paper lay crumpled, partially hidden. He picked it up carefully, smoothing it across the bench. It was a diagram, simple lines connecting rectangles, almost like a crude map of the yard. Numbers had been scribbled along the edges in pencil, some underlined twice, some erased and rewritten. He made a note to compare it with the layout of the siding later. The sound of footsteps echoed softly in the distance. Hale glanced toward the open doorway. The corridor beyond was empty, but the echo carried, bouncing off the metal siding and walls. He stepped lightly back toward the passage, careful not to disturb anything further. Outside, the rain had intensified slightly, tapping against the corrugated metal roofs in irregular patterns. A faint metallic smell rose from the wet ground, mingling with the scent of moss and old wood. Hale's attention shifted to a small hatch in the floor near the workbench. The latch was slightly misaligned, and when he lifted it, the hinges protested with a low groan. Beneath was a shallow cavity, lined with dust and debris. Among it, a few small, metallic fragments glinted. He picked them up one by one, turning them over in his gloved fingers. Each had tiny scratches, almost imperceptible, along their edges. He set them carefully into a paper envelope, noting how such small items could easily go unnoticed. Walking back into the yard, Hale noticed a series of footprints in the soft earth along the far fence. They were faint, partially washed away by rain, but the pattern was deliberate. He followed them slowly, each step careful, until they disappeared near an old tool shed. The shed door was ajar. Hale pushed it open gently. Inside, The smell of damp wood and old paint filled his nose. A coil of rope hung from a nail, frayed at one end. Near it, a small smear of a dark substance streaked along the wall, almost like a hand had brushed against it. He traced it lightly with a fingertip, the cool dampness leaving a faint imprint on his glove. In the corner of the shed, a crate had been overturned. Its contents, assorted metal fittings, brushes, and a single, partially empty roll of tape, spilled slightly onto the floor. Hale bent down to examine them. A few pieces of tape were marked with faint impressions, almost like fingerprints pressed into the adhesive. He lifted them, noting the irregularity, and placed them carefully into an evidence bag. Outside, the rain had slowed, leaving the ground slick and reflective. Hale paused, looking across the yard toward the train, its dark form outlined by the faint glow of distant lights. Every small observation, the scratches, the residues, the misaligned doors, the footprints, felt like threads leading somewhere just beyond reach. He exhaled slowly, letting the quiet settle around him, aware that each discovery was another whisper in a story still unfolding, a story that refused to reveal its full shape all at once. Hale moved along the edge of the yard toward the older administration building, its brickwork darkened by years of damp and soot. The heavy wooden door was slightly warped, leaving a narrow gap at the bottom where pale light from the corridor inside spilled faintly. He paused, noticing the faint smell of dust and ink, mingled with the lingering tang of cleaning solvent. Carefully, he pushed the door, which swung open with a muted creak, revealing a narrow hallway lined with filing cabinets. The floor was uneven, the tiles chipped and worn, and Hale's boots pressed against them with a muted clack. He bent to examine a scuff mark near the base of a cabinet. Someone had knelt here recently. The pattern was irregular, the soil pressed into the grooves of the tile. A small, copper-colored fragment, maybe part of a fastener, lay half-hidden beneath the cabinet. He picked it up with gloved fingers, rolling it gently between thumb and forefinger. The weight was insignificant, but its shape suggested it had broken off from something larger, possibly mechanical. A single lamp flickered overhead, casting shadows that trembled across the walls. Hale ran his eyes along the cabinets, noticing a thin layer of dust interrupted by faint finger trails. One drawer had been opened more recently than the others. The handle bore smudges of dirt and something darker, almost imperceptible in the dim light. He opened it slowly, careful not to disturb anything further. Inside lay ledgers, neatly stacked, but one had a corner bent back, a series of numbers underlined in pencil. He traced them with his gloved hand, noting their neat, deliberate pattern. From the corridor outside, a faint shuffle echoed, a distant step on the concrete outside, then nothing. Hale turned slightly, listening. The building was otherwise silent, but the faint hum of ventilation and the occasional drip from a leaky pipe reminded him that this place, too, had its own rhythms. He moved down a narrow set of stairs leading to the basement, the walls damp, the smell of wet concrete and faint mildew rising. A handrail was coated with dust, interrupted by a single, recent smudge. He followed the track slowly, stepping lightly. At the bottom, the basement opened into a room lined with shelves. Boxes, crates, and old equipment were stacked haphazardly, their surfaces coated in dust. Hale noticed a faint line of debris leading to a corner where a small door was set low into the wall. The door was partially obscured by an overturned crate. Hale knelt, sliding it aside with care. The door itself was scratched along the edges, as if someone had pushed against it repeatedly. A faint smell of oil and metal seeped through the gap. He lifted the latch, the hinges whining softly, revealing a shallow crawl space. Inside, the floor was covered with a thin layer of dust, broken only by tiny, irregular impressions. Hale crouched, following them with his gloved fingers. The tracks suggested careful movement. Someone had crawled or knelt, deliberate but unhurried, leaving only the faintest trace of their passage. Near the far wall of the crawl space, a small bundle of fabric lay folded carefully. Hale picked it up, noting the stiffness of the material and the faint smudge along one edge, a subtle mark that hinted at handling. He set it aside in a bag, mindful of preserving the scene. Returning to the main basement, Hale's attention drifted to an old water heater in the corner. Its surface was streaked with rust and condensation, but a small patch near the base looked newer, the metal slightly scratched and shiny in comparison. He knelt, brushing a gloved hand across it, feeling the tiny grooves etched into the surface. Something had been placed here, removed and handled carefully. A narrow vent at the far end of the room drew his eye. Dust had settled on the grill, but a single line of particles had been disturbed, forming a faint trail toward the open doorway. Hale followed it slowly, noting how deliberate it appeared, as though someone had brushed against it while moving through the room. Outside, the night pressed in quietly, the occasional drip of water from the eaves and the distant hum of a train engine forming a rhythm that set the pace of his observations. Hale stood in the center of the basement, absorbing the collection of subtle clues, the fingerprints in dust, the smudges on handles, the disturbed debris. Each one was insignificant alone, but together they hinted at careful, deliberate movement. The story was unfolding in the smallest details: scratches along edges, faint smells in the air, traces of human presence left almost imperceptibly. Hale exhaled slowly, aware that he was piecing together something that would not reveal itself all at once, each discovery quietly pulling him deeper into the mystery. Hale emerged from the basement into the narrow alley behind the administration building. The night was still, the rain from earlier leaving the bricks damp and glistening in the dim glow of the yard lamps. He paused near a rusted pipe that ran along the wall, noting the way droplets had gathered at its joints and fallen in a slow, irregular rhythm. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it drew his attention to the ground beneath. Small splashes in the puddles, each slightly darker than the surrounding water. He followed the alley around a corner where an old shipping container leaned against the wall. Its paint was faded, peeling, and the metal door bore scratches along the edge, shallow but uneven. Hale knelt to examine the base, brushing aside damp leaves to reveal a faint, scuffed line in the dust. It curved toward a small drainage grate, partially clogged with debris. He crouched lower, peering inside. The grate's metal was cold, slick with moisture, and something dark clung to the inner edges. He touched it lightly with a gloved finger, feeling the faint resistance, and noted the smell, sharp, metallic, almost imperceptible against the background dampness. A few steps further, the alley opened into a small courtyard. The space was enclosed on 3 sides by brick walls, the 4th opening onto another section of the yard. Rusted metal chairs and an overturned cart leaned against the walls. In one corner, a puddle reflected the dim light, but Hale noticed a thin line of residue stretching across the concrete, sticky, faintly glossy, and disturbed by shallow footprints. He knelt to examine them, feeling the subtle ridges beneath his fingertips. Each step seemed deliberate, careful, and the spacing suggested someone had paused, shifted, or knelt while moving through the courtyard. Near the center of the courtyard, a ventilation hatch protruded slightly from the ground. Its cover was scratched, small nicks along the edges that might have been made by tools. Hale lifted the cover gently. Beneath, a shallow cavity revealed damp earth and bits of debris. Something caught the light, a fragment of paper, crumpled and faintly stained. He retrieved it, smoothing it carefully across his palm. A few letters were legible, numbers and a partial word, underlined twice in pencil. He set it aside in an envelope, noting how carefully it had been tucked into the cavity. The sound of movement caught his attention, soft shuffling from the far side of the yard. He froze, listening. A single bird took flight from a puddle, wings flapping briefly before settling in the shadows. Hale continued slowly, circling a low brick wall to reach a small storage shed. Its door was closed but not locked. He nudged it, and the door swung inward with a muted groan. Inside, tools were scattered across a workbench. A single wrench lay separated from the others, its handle bearing faint smudges, different from the rest. Hale picked it up, rotating it carefully, and noticed a tiny streak of residue along the side, a different color than the usual oil and grease that coated the other tools. Along the back wall of the shed, a stack of wooden crates had been shifted, leaving a narrow gap. Hale crouched, shining his flashlight into the space. A thin coil of wire peeked from the shadows, bent at several points as though someone had manipulated it by hand. He reached in carefully, lifting it and noting the subtle impressions along the length, almost as if someone had tested its tension, checking it repeatedly. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the yard slick and reflective. The faint sound of distant traffic drifted in, mingling with the occasional drip of water from the eaves. Hale paused near a puddle, watching the distorted reflection of the lamplight. Tiny flecks of debris floated briefly on the surface before sinking. Each small disturbance, the residue, the scratches, the prints, the fragments, felt deliberate, methodical, and meaningful. Hale moved toward the far end of the courtyard, where an old brick archway led into another service area. The air here smelled faintly of rust and damp wood, the bricks uneven beneath his hands as he touched them. A discarded glove lay near the base of a drain pipe, its cuff stretched and slightly frayed. Hale picked it up, noting the way the fabric had softened in some areas, while the palm remained stiff, coated in a thin layer of grime. He set it carefully into a bag, aware that even the smallest item might hold a clue. A faint light flickered from a window above him. Hale looked up, the pane smeared and streaked with condensation. A shadow passed briefly behind it, too fast to identify, but enough to remind him that the yard was not entirely empty. He exhaled slowly, scanning the ground, the walls, the scattered debris. Each observation added a subtle thread to the unfolding story. The case was not yet clear, but the small, unusual details, traces of movement, faint residues, minor disruptions in an otherwise ordinary landscape, were beginning to speak in a quiet, insistent language. Hale took a slow step forward, careful on the slick concrete, and continued along the edge of the courtyard, aware that each corner, each small object, each faint mark could carry significance. The night stretched on, quiet and patient, holding its secrets just out of reach, coaxing him deeper into the unhurried rhythm of discovery. Hale left the courtyard and followed a narrow service path that led between the back of the maintenance shed and a line of old freight containers. The ground here was uneven, patches of gravel mixed with compacted mud, slick from the earlier rain. He paused near a low brick wall, brushing his gloved hand along its damp surface. The bricks were rough, coated with a thin layer of moss in places. Tiny streaks of lighter-colored dust caught in the crevices, interrupted by faint smudges, as though something had been pressed or dragged along the wall. A narrow door set into the side of one container caught his attention. The handle was scratched, small nicks along the edge consistent with repeated use. Hale leaned close, pressing an ear to the metal. There was nothing, no voices, no movement. Only the faint drip of water from the roof above. He nudged the door gently. It swung inward a few inches, revealing a cluttered interior. Boxes and crates were stacked unevenly, some leaning precariously. The floor was dusty, but faint scuff marks led toward the far corner, where a crate had been moved slightly away from the wall. Hale knelt, brushing aside a thin layer of dust. The scuff marks suggested someone had knelt there, pushing or adjusting the crate. Beneath it, a small fragment of something metallic glinted. He picked it up carefully, rough, triangular, its edges worn. He rotated it in his gloved hand, noting the subtle scratches along the surface, almost like abrasion from repeated contact with another surface. He set it aside in a bag, aware that even the smallest fragment might matter later. A soft, metallic creak echoed from above. Hale looked up, catching the glint of a narrow skylight partially covered with grime. The pane was streaked, and a faint handprint smudged the surface, half faded but still discernible in the dim light. He made a mental note, tracing the possible path someone could have taken to reach it. Exiting the container, he followed a narrow lane between two rows of storage sheds. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and rusting metal. He noticed faint tracks in the mud, small, deliberate impressions, spaced unevenly, suggesting pauses, shifts in weight, careful steps rather than hurried movement. He crouched to examine them, brushing away loose debris. A faint streak of a reddish-brown residue clung to the edge of one print, almost imperceptible. Hale inhaled slowly, aware of how subtle it was, yet certain it was significant. Ahead, a small alcove formed by the junction of two sheds held a stack of pallets. The wood was damp, some slats cracked. Hale leaned close, noticing a thin wire protruding from between the pallets, bent at several points. He reached in, lifting it carefully. Tiny scratches along its length suggested manipulation, deliberate bending, and straightening. He set it aside, observing how the soft drip of rainwater from the eaves created tiny puddles along the concrete floor, each ripple catching the muted glow of overhead lamps. A metal door at the far end of the alley bore faint fingerprints, smeared slightly. Hale traced them with a gloved fingertip, noting the pressure and direction. Someone had gripped it lightly, then moved away without disturbing the surrounding dust. He pushed the door slowly, revealing a narrow corridor leading into an abandoned workshop. The air smelled of oil and old paint, slightly sour in the dampness. Tools were scattered across benches, some knocked over, others neatly placed. On a low shelf, Hale noticed a pair of gloves, coated in a fine layer of dust, but one bore faint smudges along the fingers, darker than the rest. He picked them up gently, noting the slight stickiness of the residue, and held them up to the light. The impressions were subtle but deliberate, as if the gloves had been used recently, then set aside. Near the corner of the workshop, a pile of rags lay half unfolded. Hale moved them carefully, revealing a small, folded piece of paper beneath. He smoothed it gently across the bench. Pencil marks traced simple diagrams, lines connecting shapes, numbers written and crossed out, corrected, underlined. Nothing explicit, yet the page carried intention, planning, an echo of human movement and thought left behind in quiet, careful gestures. Outside again, the night pressed in, still and patient. The distant hum of a train engine floated faintly through the yard. Hale's steps were deliberate on the slick concrete, his eyes scanning each shadow, each reflection in the puddles. Every minor detail, the faint residue, the scuff marks, the fingerprints, the disturbed dust, added a subtle layer to the story unfolding around him. He walked slowly along the edge of the workshop, aware that the next discovery, however small, could tilt the investigation in a new direction, yet that moment had not arrived. The case remained patient, whispering in tiny, careful motions, and he moved through it, piece by piece, quietly listening. Hale stepped out from the workshop into a narrow lane between the storage sheds. The ground was uneven, a mix of gravel and concrete slabs, slick with remnants of rain. Faint reflections shimmered in shallow puddles, and the damp air carried a faint, metallic tang, mingled with the scent of aged wood and oil. He paused near a rusted drain pipe, noticing a small, folded scrap of paper caught in the corner where the wall met the ground. The edges were damp, curling slightly. He picked it up with gloved fingers, smoothing it gently. Numbers and a few letters were scribbled hastily, some smudged, as if pressed into the paper with wet fingertips. A short distance ahead, a low archway led into a courtyard overlooked by an old signal tower. The bricks were mottled with moss and mildew, the mortar cracked in places. Hale crouched to examine a small patch of earth where weeds had been flattened recently, faint depressions suggesting someone had knelt or shifted their weight there. Between the cracks, he spotted tiny flecks of a dark residue, almost glossy, barely noticeable unless one looked closely. He traced the path with a gloved finger, noting the direction it led, toward a corner where a set of metal doors leaned slightly ajar. The doors opened onto a storage yard lined with stacked crates, some weathered and gray, others still retaining chipped paint. A narrow passage ran along the edge, where shadows pooled between the stacks. Hale walked slowly, the soles of his boots crunching softly against gravel. On one crate, the paint was scratched, small marks tracing an irregular pattern as if something had been dragged or pressed against it. He leaned closer, brushing a fingertip over the marks, noting a faint, oily residue clinging to the grooves. Near the center of the yard, a coil of wire lay tangled on the ground. Hale crouched to examine it, noticing subtle bends and twists that suggested careful manipulation rather than random tangling. He picked it up, rolling it lightly in his gloved hands. Tiny abrasions ran along the surface, almost imperceptible, and a faint metallic scent lingered. He set it aside in a small evidence bag, careful not to disturb anything else. A narrow staircase at the far end of the yard led to a mezzanine above a long row of crates. Hale climbed slowly, the metal steps slick from condensation. At the top, he could see the layout more clearly. Stacks of containers forming a maze of corridors, puddles reflecting the faint light from overhead lamps. One crate in particular caught his eye. Its edges were chipped, and the surface bore subtle scratches that seemed out of place, too deliberate to be accidental. He crouched, tracing the scratches with his fingers, noting the slight residue that clung to the edges. Along the mezzanine railing, a small pair of gloves lay forgotten. Hale picked them up, noting the palms were worn, coated in faint grime, but the fingers bore darker streaks. He examined the streaks closely, pressing lightly with his fingers. They left an imprint in the dust, a subtle but deliberate pattern, as if someone had handled something repeatedly and carefully before discarding the gloves. A faint clatter drew his attention to the far corner of the mezzanine. He moved toward it slowly, the soft metallic echoes of his boots against the grating mingling with the distant hum of a train engine. There, a small hatch in the floor was slightly raised. Hale crouched, brushing dust aside. The hinges were worn, faint scratches along the edges suggesting repeated opening and closing. He lifted the hatch carefully, revealing a narrow crawl space beneath. Inside, the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust, disturbed in irregular patches. Hale traced the subtle impressions with his gloved fingers, noting the deliberate, measured pattern of movement. Beneath a small pile of debris, a fragment of metal caught the light. He picked it up, turning it slowly in his hand. It was lightweight, jagged at one edge, and bore faint, almost imperceptible scratches along its surface. He tucked it into his pocket, aware that even the smallest fragment might hold significance. Outside, the night air pressed cool and damp against Hale's face. The distant yard lamps flickered, casting long shadows across the puddles and uneven ground. Each detail, the scratches, the residue, the subtle impressions in dust and mud, seemed to speak in quiet, deliberate language. Hale exhaled slowly, moving along the edge of the mezzanine, attuned to every minor disturbance. The yard held its secrets patiently, offering only small, careful clues, and Hale walked through them, each step drawing him deeper into the slow, unhurried rhythm of the investigation. Hale descended from the mezzanine and followed a narrow service corridor between two long freight buildings. The concrete underfoot was slick, patches dark with moisture, and the faint smell of oil lingered in the air. Along one wall, pipes ran in a crooked line, and at one joint, a thin streak of dark residue caught the light. Hale knelt, brushing it gently with a fingertip. It had a subtle tackiness, faintly metallic, and he traced it along the wall to where it disappeared behind a pallet stacked with crates. He shifted the pallet slightly, the wood groaning under its weight, revealing a small metal box wedged into the corner. Its surface was scratched and scuffed, corners dented as if it had been moved or dropped repeatedly. Hale opened it slowly. Inside lay a coil of thin wire, carefully looped, and a small roll of tape, the edges frayed. The tape bore faint impressions, almost like fingerprints pressed into the adhesive. He set the box aside, noting how deliberately it had been placed and hidden, almost as though someone wanted it discovered by someone careful enough to notice. A door at the end of the corridor led into an empty storage room. The air smelled faintly of damp cardboard and mildew. Hale stepped in, the soft echo of his boots against the concrete punctuated by the occasional drip from a leaky pipe. On a low shelf near the far wall, a pair of gloves lay neatly folded. The palms were coated in dust, but the fingers bore darker streaks. Hale picked them up, flexing them gently. Small abrasions on the fabric suggested careful use, and he noticed a faint smear along the thumb, a dark tint that contrasted with the rest. Near the corner, a crate had been shifted slightly, leaving a narrow gap against the wall. Hale crouched, peering into the space. A small, crumpled piece of paper lay partially tucked beneath the crate. He smoothed it out and saw a series of numbers, underlined and crossed out in pencil. A faint scent of graphite and something faintly chemical rose from the page. He tucked it carefully into an envelope, setting it aside for later analysis. He moved toward a small hatch set low in the floor. The metal was cold to the touch, edges worn and scratched, as if it had been opened and closed many times. Hale lifted it, revealing a shallow cavity filled with dust and tiny fragments of metal. Among them, a small shard glinted faintly. He picked it up carefully, rolling it between his gloved fingers. The edges were sharp, and the surface bore fine scratches, almost imperceptible. A faint echo of footsteps reached him from the far end of the building. Hale paused, listening, the air cool and still. The sound faded, leaving only the soft dripping from the pipes and the distant hum of machinery from the yard. He returned to the corridor, scanning the floor for faint impressions. Tiny scuffs in the dust led toward a narrow side door. Hale approached slowly, brushing his fingers over the frame. A faint smear, darker than the surrounding dust, traced the edge of the door. Outside, the rain had left puddles reflecting the pale yellow light of distant lamps. Hale moved along the edge of the yard, stepping carefully to avoid disturbing the faint tracks in the mud. Near an old chain-link fence, a coil of cable lay discarded, frayed at one end. He lifted it, noting the subtle bends, irregular twists along its length. Each seemed deliberate, as though someone had manipulated it carefully. A small shed beyond the fence caught his attention. Its door was slightly ajar. Hale nudged it open gently. Inside, tools were scattered across a workbench. One wrench lay separate from the others, its handle bearing faint smudges. Hale picked it up, turning it in his gloved hand. The surface bore a subtle residue, almost sticky, faintly metallic. He set it aside, noting the careful way it had been handled. Along the back wall of the shed, a pile of rags partially concealed a shallow cavity. Hale shifted them aside, revealing a folded piece of paper. Pencil marks traced simple lines and shapes, numbers scribbled and crossed out, corrected and underlined. The page spoke of intention, planning, and human presence left in careful, quiet gestures. Hale stepped back, letting his eyes roam over the shed, the yard, the puddles reflecting distant lamps. Every small detail, the residue, the smudges, the scratches, the faint impressions in dust and mud, added to the quiet, unhurried rhythm of the investigation. Each trace was a whisper in the night, leading him slowly, deliberately, deeper into a mystery that refused to fully reveal itself, demanding patience, observation, and care. Hale stepped out of the shed into a narrow lane that led toward the older section of the yard. The ground was uneven, a mixture of compacted gravel, mud, and scattered patches of moss. Puddles reflected the dull glow of a single overhead lamp, distorted by tiny ripples from a soft, persistent drip off the eaves. Hale paused, noticing a faint line of disturbed gravel, irregular and shallow, leading along the edge of the brick wall. He knelt, brushing aside loose stones, and uncovered a fragment of metal, thin and flat, with a jagged edge and a faint trace of reddish residue clinging to it. A small, low door at the base of the wall was slightly warped. Its hinges creaked quietly as Hale nudged it open with the tip of his boot. The interior revealed a cramped storage space, lined with shelves stacked with dusty boxes. The smell of old paper mixed with damp wood. On one shelf, a small coil of wire rested loosely atop a box. Hale lifted it, noting subtle bends along its length, uneven but deliberate, as though someone had tested it repeatedly. Near the back, a pile of rags had shifted, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Hale crouched, careful not to disturb the surrounding dust. Inside lay a crumpled sheet of paper, edges damp and curling. Numbers and letters were scribbled in pencil, some erased and rewritten, others underlined twice. He smoothed it flat, tracing the markings with a fingertip. The faint scent of graphite and a chemical tang lingered. Exiting the storage space, Hale moved toward a small set of stairs leading to an upper mezzanine above the yard. The metal steps were slick with condensation, and the rail was cold and rough under his gloved hand. From the mezzanine, he could see the yard stretched out like a quiet, desolate maze of crates, containers, and puddles. One crate in particular bore faint scratches along the edges, almost forming a subtle pattern. Hale leaned closer, brushing his gloved fingers over the marks, feeling the slight tackiness of residue along the grooves. A narrow catwalk ran along the side of the mezzanine, leading to a door high on the adjacent wall. Hale stepped carefully, each footfall soft against the metal grating. Small droplets of water had collected in tiny depressions, forming delicate, shimmering beads that threatened to slip underfoot. The door was unlatched, and Hale opened it slowly, revealing a storage loft above an old workshop. The air smelled faintly of oil, rust, and old paint. Inside the loft, tools were scattered across benches, some overturned, others neatly stacked. On a low shelf, a pair of gloves lay folded. Hale picked them up, noticing faint smudges along the fingertips, darker than the surrounding dust. He flexed them gently, feeling tiny abrasions along the fabric, almost imperceptible. Each mark suggested careful use, deliberate handling. Near a corner, a small hatch in the floor caught his attention. Its edges were scratched, hinges worn, as if it had been opened repeatedly. Hale lifted it, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. The floor inside was dust-covered, interrupted by irregular impressions. Knees, fingertips, the subtle disturbances of careful movement. Beneath a loose floorboard, a tiny fragment of metal glinted faintly in the light. He picked it up, rolling it gently between his gloved fingers, noting scratches along the edges and a faint trace of a substance he couldn't identify immediately. Outside again, the night was still, cool, and quiet. The distant hum of a train echoed faintly through the yard, punctuated by soft drips of water from the rooftops. Hale moved slowly along the perimeter, eyes scanning for the faintest sign of disturbance. Near an old brick wall, he noticed a thin streak along the mortar, darker than the surrounding surface. He touched it lightly. A faint tackiness remained on his glove, the kind of subtle, almost invisible residue that suggested someone had pressed against the wall recently. He followed the streak along the edge, stepping lightly over puddles, until it led to a small, dilapidated shed tucked into the corner of the yard. The door was ajar. Hale nudged it open gently, the hinges groaning softly. Inside, the space smelled of damp wood and oil. Tools were scattered across benches. A single wrench lay apart from the others, its handle bearing faint smudges. Hale picked it up, turning it in his gloved hand. Subtle impressions along the side, small and deliberate, suggested careful handling. In the far corner, a pile of rags partially concealed a narrow cavity. Hale shifted them aside. Inside lay a small folded sheet of paper, pencil marks tracing simple diagrams, numbers scribbled, erased, rewritten, underlined. The page suggested intent, a quiet planning left behind in careful gestures. Hale tucked it gently into his evidence bag, aware that even the smallest items, the smudges, scratches, faint residues, and impressions in dust, were whispers in the story, each one a subtle guide deeper into the unfolding mystery. He stepped back into the yard, letting his eyes roam over puddles, crates, and shadows. Every surface held its own quiet testimony. The bent wire, the faint streaks on walls, the impressions in dust. The case remained patient, revealing itself only in the smallest, almost imperceptible details. Hale exhaled slowly, moving forward with deliberate care, letting the night guide him along the unhurried path of observation. Every minor discovery a pulse in the rhythm of the investigation. Hale left the corner shed and followed a narrow strip of gravel that ran between the yard and a line of older freight buildings. The air was cool and damp, carrying a faint tang of rust and oil. Small puddles reflected the dim glow of a single, flickering yard lamp, and each step he took sent tiny ripples across their surfaces. He paused, noticing a subtle disturbance in the gravel, a shallow line that curved along the edge of the building. Brushing aside loose stones, he revealed a small fragment of metal, thin and triangular, edges worn, faintly streaked with something darker. Ahead, a narrow doorway led into what had once been a small shipping office. The floorboards were warped, creaking softly under his weight. Hale crouched, brushing dust from a corner where a low filing cabinet met the wall. Fingerprints pressed lightly into the accumulated grime were barely visible, smudged, and irregular. One drawer was slightly ajar. Inside, paperwork was stacked neatly, except for a single sheet, its edge bent back. Numbers and letters had been written in pencil, corrections faintly erased, lines underlined in careful repetition. A faint metallic scent rose from the floor beneath the cabinet. Hale knelt, pressing a gloved finger against a tiny smudge. It left a faint tackiness on his glove, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest recent handling. He followed the trail along the baseboard, where dust had been disturbed in an irregular pattern, leading toward a small hatch in the corner. The hatch was low, its metal edges worn and slightly rusted. Hale lifted it slowly. The space beneath revealed a shallow cavity, floor covered in dust and tiny fragments of metal and wood. A narrow line of impressions ran along one side, irregular in shape, as if someone had knelt, shifted, and moved carefully, leaving only faint signs of their presence. Beneath the loose board, a small shard of something metallic glimmered in the dim light. He picked it up, turning it slowly in gloved hands, noting scratches and a faint residue along the edge. He returned to the yard and approached a service path leading behind another freight building. The path was narrow, bordered by weeds and damp bricks. Small droplets of water fell from the roof, landing silently on the ground. Near a rusted ventilation pipe, Hale noticed a thin, almost imperceptible streak along the mortar. He touched it lightly with his glove. It was sticky, faintly metallic, and led toward a small alcove where an old stack of pallets leaned against the wall. Hale shifted the pallets with care, revealing a low door partially hidden behind them. The door was warped, scratches along the edges suggesting repeated manipulation. He pressed his ear to it. The space beyond was silent, faintly cool. He nudged it open slowly, revealing a narrow storage room. Dust covered the floor, disturbed in irregular patches. On a low shelf, a pair of gloves lay folded. Hale picked them up. The fingers bore dark smudges contrasting with the dusty palms. Small abrasions along the fabric suggested careful use, repeated handling. Near the back wall, a small pile of rags concealed a shallow cavity. Hale shifted them aside. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, pencil markings tracing simple diagrams, lines connecting numbers and letters. Some had been erased and rewritten, underlined twice. He tucked it gently into his evidence bag. Exiting into the yard again, Hale's eyes moved slowly over the puddles, crates, and shadows. Each subtle detail, the smudges, scratches, residue, and impressions, spoke in quiet fragments. A faint sound of water dripping, distant machinery, and the occasional scuff of his boots on gravel punctuated the stillness. Hale took deliberate steps along the edge of the yard, aware that each minor discovery was part of a careful, patient rhythm, a whisper of human movement in the night, drawing him deeper into the slow, unhurried unraveling of the mystery. At the far end of the yard, he noticed a narrow catwalk attached to the side of a warehouse. Rust streaked the metal, the paint blistered, and the steps were slick from condensation. Hale ascended slowly, listening to the soft echo of his boots. At the top, a small door led into a loft above the warehouse. He opened it carefully. The air was thick with dust, faintly oily, tinged with the acrid smell of old paint. Tools and supplies were scattered across low shelves, some knocked over, others carefully stacked. On the floor, a small coil of wire lay partially unspooled, its bends irregular but deliberate. Hale picked it up, rolling it gently between his gloved fingers. Tiny scratches along its length suggested repeated manipulation. A faint metallic scent lingered. Near the corner, a shallow cavity beneath loose floorboards revealed another small fragment of metal, edges jagged, lightly streaked with residue. Hale tucked it away. Outside again, the night was quiet, heavy with damp air. Reflections from puddles shimmered faintly in the dim yard lights. Every surface, brick, metal, puddle, and dust-covered floor, carried subtle signs of recent, careful activity. Hale exhaled slowly, moving with deliberate caution. The mystery remained patient, hiding its full shape, revealing itself only through small, careful traces, each one coaxing him deeper into the intricate, unhurried rhythm of the investigation. Hale left the loft and descended back to the yard, stepping carefully over the uneven gravel that had hardened into soft ridges beneath the night's rain. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete and rusted metal, and a light mist clung to the edges of the buildings. He paused near an old, low brick wall separating the yard from a narrow alley. A faint line of lighter dust ran along the top, disturbed in several places. He knelt, brushing his gloved fingers over it. There were tiny streaks, almost imperceptible, like something had been dragged slowly along the surface, then lifted. He followed the line to the alley, where the walls closed in more tightly. A narrow drain ran along one edge, filled with the detritus of fallen leaves and small scraps of paper. One scrap, darkened by moisture, bore a faint pencil mark. Hale picked it up carefully, noting the faint residue that clung to the edges. The mark was nothing more than a short line, yet the placement suggested deliberate intent. He slipped it into his pocket. A small service door halfway down the alley was slightly ajar, and the faint scent of oil and dust drifted outward. Hale eased it open. The room inside was compact, cluttered with shelves of old tools and boxes. He ran a gloved hand along the edge of a bench, noticing a small scratch in the worn wood, barely deep enough to catch the light. Beneath it, a smudge, dark and slightly tacky, suggested recent handling. He crouched to examine it, following faint trails of dust disturbances that led toward a small, corner cupboard. Inside the cupboard lay a stack of folded rags. Hale moved them carefully. A small, rusted fragment of wire had been tucked underneath, bent at unusual angles, ends frayed. Nearby, a notebook with dog-eared pages rested, pencil markings faintly visible through a layer of dust. He flipped it open gently, revealing scattered numbers and diagrams, some connected by lines, some scribbled out entirely. Hale noted the careful yet messy attention, as though someone had been working quietly, alone, and interrupted. A tiny noise, a soft scrape against metal, caught his attention. He turned slowly toward a narrow staircase leading up to an elevated platform above the room. The metal steps were slick with condensation, and a faint smell of wet paint hung in the air. At the top, a small hatch was slightly lifted. Hale eased it open. Inside, the loft space was narrow, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. Dust lay thick across the floor, disturbed in irregular patches, forming faint tracks. One corner held a small pile of debris. Hale shifted it aside to reveal another fragment of metal, thin, with jagged edges and a faint reddish-brown smudge along one side. He moved across the loft carefully, scanning the floor. A faint streak ran along a beam, sticky to the touch, darker in certain spots, as though someone had leaned or pressed against it repeatedly. Hale traced it slowly with his gloved finger, following the subtle path that led toward a small, narrow door set into the far wall. It opened into a corridor that ran above the roofline of the warehouse. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of wet shingles and faint smoke from a distant chimney. Along the corridor, a loose plank rattled slightly under his weight. Hale crouched, brushing the dust aside. Tiny scratches traced along the wood grain, shallow but deliberate, as if someone had tested the plank's surface carefully. Beneath, a tiny fragment of paper was wedged. He pried it free and unfolded it gently. A single line of letters, faintly smudged, underlined twice. Hale exhaled slowly and continued along the corridor. Each step brought new, subtle evidence. Faint residues, small scratches, impressions in dust, and the occasional tiny scrap of paper or fragment of metal. Hale stepped away from the shed and followed a narrow path between the yard and a row of low, corrugated warehouses. The gravel beneath his boots was damp, uneven, and dotted with small puddles reflecting the pale yellow light from a lamp mounted high on the wall. A faint wind stirred through the alley, carrying the scent of wet concrete and rusted metal. Along the edge, a shallow groove in the gravel caught his attention. He knelt, brushing aside small stones, revealing a thin strip of wire, slightly frayed at one end, coated in a faint, sticky residue. The path ended at a rusted gate, chained but not locked. Hale eased it open, the metal groaning softly. Beyond was a small, abandoned loading platform. Wooden planks were warped, slick with condensation, and the air smelled faintly of mold and old oil. Hale moved slowly, scanning the edges of the platform. One plank bore a faint scrape along its surface, irregular and shallow, as if something had been slid across it. He pressed a gloved finger to the mark. The subtle tackiness lingered on his glove, faint but persistent. Near the far end, a narrow stairwell led up to a second-story office. The steps creaked lightly under his weight. At the top, the office door was slightly ajar. Hale pushed it open carefully. Inside, dust motes drifted in the weak glow of a single bulb. The air smelled of damp paper and faint chemical tangs, like cleaning solvents long since evaporated. Desks were scattered with stacks of documents, some overturned, others still neatly aligned. On one corner desk, a small metal clip lay discarded, its surface scratched, edges dulled. Hale picked it up, feeling tiny traces of residue along the edges. A filing cabinet along the wall was partially open. Hale crouched to examine the floor beneath it. Dust had settled unevenly, interrupted by faint impressions. Fingertips, knees, subtle shifts in weight. Between them, a small scrap of paper lay wedged, dampened slightly at the edges. Pencil marks traced short lines, underlined twice in deliberate repetition. Hale folded it carefully into his evidence bag. A faint noise drew his attention, a soft metallic tapping from the far corner. Hale approached slowly. There, a low ventilation shaft led into darkness. The edges of the grill were scratched and smudged, coated with faint, sticky traces that suggested repeated handling. He crouched, pressing a gloved hand against the grime. Tiny flecks of metal clung to his glove. The pattern of disturbance suggested deliberate, careful movement, almost ritualistic in its subtlety. Descending back to the yard, Hale followed a narrow service corridor along the side of another warehouse. The air smelled of wet concrete, old paint, and faintly of oil. A series of shallow depressions ran along the concrete, interrupted by faint streaks of residue. Hale knelt, examining each carefully. One streak led to a corner where a stack of wooden pallets leaned against the wall. He shifted them gently. Beneath, a shallow cavity held a small coil of wire, bent irregularly at several points. Tiny abrasions marked the surface, and a faint metallic tang lingered. Nearby, a small hatch in the floor was partially raised. Hale lifted it, revealing a narrow crawl space beneath. Dust covered the floor, disturbed in irregular patterns. He traced faint impressions along the ground, knees, fingertips, and subtle scuffs from careful steps. Under a loose board, a tiny shard of metal glimmered faintly. Hale picked it up, turning it slowly in his gloved hand, noting the jagged edges and faint smears of a dark substance. Outside, the night pressed cool and still. Puddles reflected the dull yard lights, the surface broken occasionally by drops of condensation falling from the roof. Hale moved along the edge of the yard, pausing to examine subtle disturbances in the mud. Tiny impressions suggested deliberate steps, pauses, shifts in weight. Near an overgrown fence, a small shed leaned precariously. Its door was ajar. Hale nudged it gently. Inside, the shed smelled of damp wood and faint oil. Tools were scattered across benches. One hammer lay apart, the handle coated with subtle smudges. Hale picked it up, feeling the faint abrasions along the side. In the corner, a pile of rags partially concealed a cavity. Hale shifted them carefully. A folded sheet of paper rested inside. Pencil lines connecting numbers and letters, some erased and corrected. He tucked it gently into his evidence bag. The courtyard beyond remained quiet. Every surface, the bricks, puddles, wooden planks, and dust-covered floors, held traces of human presence, faint and deliberate. Hale exhaled slowly, moving with deliberate care. Each minor discovery, the smudges, scratches, residue, and impressions, was a whisper in the night, a fragment of the story. He continued forward, step by step, attuned to the quiet rhythm of the investigation, patient and unhurried, drawing slowly deeper into the intricate web of small, subtle clues that the case revealed only piece by piece. Hale moved along the edge of the courtyard, stepping carefully over patches of moss that clung to damp brick and concrete. The night air was cool, carrying a faint metallic tang that seemed to settle in the back of his throat. A faint rustling drew his attention, a plastic bag caught in the corner of a fence, quivering in a gentle breeze. He approached and nudged it aside with his boot. Beneath it, faint scuff marks traced a narrow line along the bricks, as if something had been dragged lightly, pressed just enough to leave an impression without disturbing the surrounding dust. He followed the trail toward a long, narrow building at the far end of the courtyard. Its windows were dirty, dimly reflecting the yellow light from a distant street lamp. Hale crouched to examine the base of the wall. Dust and mud had collected in uneven layers, but in one section, a faint smear traced along the bricks. It was sticky and faintly metallic. He pressed a gloved finger along it, noting the subtle residue. The streak led to a small side door, warped and slightly ajar. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of oil and damp wood. The floorboards creaked softly under his weight. On a low shelf near the far wall, a pair of gloves lay folded. Hale picked them up carefully. The fingertips bore faint, dark streaks. The palms dusted, small abrasions along the fabric suggesting repeated, deliberate use. Near the shelf, a narrow crack in the wall caught his attention. A tiny fragment of metal rested within it, edges worn, faintly streaked with reddish residue. Hale retrieved it, rolling it slowly between gloved fingers. A narrow stairwell led to a loft above the building. Hale ascended slowly, each step echoing faintly. At the top, a small hatch opened into a dim, cramped space. Dust lay thick across the floor, interrupted by irregular depressions, knees, fingertips, subtle shuffles. Hale traced the impressions carefully, following a faint line that led to a corner where an old wooden crate had been shifted. Beneath it, a small coil of wire, bent irregularly, lay partially hidden. Tiny scratches and faint residues suggested repeated handling. On the opposite wall, a low workbench held scattered tools. One wrench lay apart, its handle marked with subtle smudges, small scratches along the metal surface. Hale picked it up and turned it slowly in his hands, feeling for anything unusual. A faint tackiness lingered, almost imperceptible, hinting at recent use. He set it aside, moving toward a small pile of rags in the corner. They concealed a shallow cavity, inside which lay a folded sheet of paper. Pencil markings connected letters and numbers in faint, careful patterns. Some lines were crossed out, others underlined twice. Hale tucked it gently into his evidence bag. Descending back into the courtyard, he noted the damp air clinging to his jacket and the quiet drip of water from the eaves. The ground was soft, uneven with puddles reflecting the scattered lamps. Near a small, overgrown fence, Hale paused. A narrow gap revealed the edge of a discarded crate. Sliding it aside, he found a tiny fragment of metal, jagged and coated with a faint residue. The placement was deliberate, as if meant to be noticed only by someone careful enough to search thoroughly. Beyond the fence, a narrow alley ran along the edge of the property. Hale moved slowly, scanning the walls for subtle disturbances. A faint smear caught the light, running along a series of bricks, sticky to the touch, metallic and irregular. Following it, he found a small shed tucked into the corner, its door slightly open. Inside, the scent of oil, damp wood, and faint paint lingered. Tools were scattered across benches. One hammer bore smudges along its handle. Hale picked it up carefully, feeling tiny abrasions along the surface. In the far corner, a pile of rags concealed a shallow cavity. Inside lay a folded sheet of paper, pencil lines connecting numbers and letters, some erased, corrected, rewritten. Hale set it gently in his evidence bag, aware that each small discovery, the smudges, scratches, residues, and faint impressions in dust or mud, was part of a quiet, deliberate rhythm. The night remained still, the yard empty, but the traces of human movement persisted, patient and unhurried. Hale exhaled slowly and continued forward, attuned to the subtle whispers of the investigation, each minor clue pulling him deeper into the slow, methodical unfolding of the case. Hale stepped back into the alley beyond the shed, his boots pressing into damp, uneven ground. The walls were dark brick, mottled with moss and streaked with moisture. A faint smell of oil lingered, mixed with the cold bite of wet concrete. The alley narrowed ahead, cluttered with discarded pallets and rusted barrels. Hale crouched to inspect the base of one barrel. A thin streak of residue ran along the bricks behind it, sticky, faintly metallic, almost invisible in the dim light. He traced it slowly with a gloved finger, noting that it led toward a narrow side door partially hidden behind stacked crates. The door was warped, its paint blistered and peeling. Hale nudged it open carefully. Inside was a small, low-ceilinged storage room, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb that flickered intermittently. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of old solvents. Shelves lined the walls, holding boxes of varying sizes. A low workbench along one side bore scattered tools. Hale ran a gloved hand over the surface, brushing aside the dust. A faint smear, dark and tacky, caught his attention. It followed the edge of the bench in a subtle curve, as if something had been moved repeatedly along the same path. Near the back of the room, a pile of rags partially concealed a shallow cavity in the floor. Hale shifted them aside. Beneath lay a small, folded sheet of paper. The pencil markings were faint, a combination of letters and numbers, some erased and rewritten, some underlined. Hale picked it up carefully, smoothing it flat. The paper smelled faintly of damp fibers and graphite. A narrow staircase at the side of the room led upward to a loft. Hale ascended slowly, the steps groaning softly under his weight. At the top, the loft stretched along the length of the room, a narrow walkway lined with crates and boxes. Dust lay thick, interrupted by irregular depressions. A knee here, a gloved finger there, subtle shifts in weight that had left barely perceptible traces. Hale followed the faint impressions, which led toward a corner where a low crate had been pushed aside. Underneath, a small coil of wire lay bent at uneven angles. Tiny scratches and traces of a sticky residue clung to it. On the opposite side of the loft, a narrow hatch led into an adjoining room. Hale lifted it carefully. Inside, the floor was scattered with more tools and scraps of metal. A small wrench lay on the floor, its handle bearing faint smudges, and tiny abrasions marked the metal along one side. Hale examined it slowly, feeling the texture with his gloved fingers. Near the corner of the room, a pile of rags covered a shallow cavity in the floor. Hale moved them aside to reveal another folded sheet of paper. Pencil lines traced letters and numbers in a careful pattern. Some lines were crossed out, others underlined twice, as though someone had been quietly planning, erasing, correcting, and rethinking each step. Hale placed the sheet gently in his evidence bag. He descended back into the alley. A faint drip echoed from the roof above, falling into a narrow puddle that shimmered under the dim light. The ground was uneven and littered with debris, but Hale noticed faint impressions along the edge of the bricks, irregular and deliberate. They led toward a narrow courtyard enclosed by tall, brick walls, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken crates. Near the center of the courtyard, a small wooden shed leaned precariously, its door ajar. Hale approached carefully. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood, oil, and faint remnants of paint. Tools lay scattered across benches. One hammer bore subtle smudges along its handle. Hale picked it up, feeling faint abrasions along the surface. In the far corner of the shed, a pile of rags concealed a shallow cavity. Hale shifted them aside. Inside lay another folded sheet of paper, pencil lines connecting letters and numbers, faintly erased and corrected, meticulously underlined. He tucked it gently into his evidence bag, noting that every trace, every faint smudge, and every irregular impression continued the slow, deliberate pattern of human presence. Outside, the courtyard remained still. Every puddle, every brick, and every patch of dust or mud carried subtle signs of movement. Hale exhaled slowly, aware of the quiet rhythm of discovery, each minor clue adding to the patient, unhurried unraveling of the mystery. He moved along the edge of the yard, alert to the faintest disturbances, listening to the soft echo of dripping water, the occasional rustle of loose debris, and the muted sound of his own careful footsteps, drawing him deeper into the meticulous, subtle language of the case. Hale paused at the edge of the courtyard, the damp night air settling around him. He looked back over the path he had followed. The puddles, the rusted barrels, the narrow lofts and storage rooms. Slowly, connections began to form, almost imperceptibly, like shadows aligning in the dim light. Each trace he had collected, the smudges, the residue, the small fragments of metal, the folded papers with faint pencil lines, suddenly made a quiet sense. The notes in the small sheets of paper, the careful erasures and underlines, weren't random. They traced movements, sequences of steps and adjustments. When he reviewed them now in his mind, a pattern emerged. Someone had been practicing the train's controls, the brake handles he had first noticed, repeating motions in a calculated but cautious way. The scratches, the wires, the small metallic fragments. They weren't evidence of hurried tampering, but of deliberate, methodical rehearsal. Hale crouched beside a shallow puddle, watching the reflection of the courtyard lights ripple across the surface. He realized the movements through the yard, the alley, the sheds, and lofts had been a rehearsal space. Each detail he had collected fit together like the steps of a careful procedure, tested over and over in preparation. He remembered the slight abrasions on the wrench, the repeated smudges on the hammer, the coil of bent wire. Each had been handled gently, repeatedly. Someone had treated these tools not as instruments for destruction, but as parts of a process they needed to understand intimately. And the papers, the diagrams, the lines, the numbers, they were instructions to themselves, a silent rehearsal written on scraps of paper in quiet rooms. The pieces clicked together quietly. The train had not been taken for chaos or malice. It had been moved carefully, deliberately, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had rehearsed each motion in near silence. The small disturbances, the faint residue, the calculated placement of tools, they were all evidence not of hurried crime, but of patient preparation. Hale exhaled slowly, the realization settling into a calm rhythm. The mystery wasn't the act itself, it was the meticulous planning behind it, the quiet insistence on precision. Every step of the investigation, the observation of small scratches, of fingerprints in dust, of subtle smudges, revealed a careful mind at work, deliberate and controlled. He stood in the courtyard, listening to the distant hum of the city, the soft drip of water from the eaves, the faint rustle of leaves. The case no longer felt like an open question. It was a quiet study in method, discipline, and subtlety. The train's movement, the handling of tools, the rehearsal spaces, they were all part of a patient plan that now, in reflection, made a coherent story. Hale gathered his notes and evidence slowly, deliberately, as if each motion mirrored the careful, meticulous approach of the person he had been tracing. The yard was silent, the night cool and still, and he walked back along the narrow paths, past puddles and mossed bricks, with the calm understanding that the mystery had not been sudden or violent. It had been quiet, careful, and deliberate. The truth settled like mist, not with a crash, but with the quiet, satisfying clarity of connections made and observed, a measured resolution reached through patience and attention. At last, Hale paused at the edge of the property, the courtyard empty behind him. He looked back once, noting the subtle traces still lingering in dust and puddles, then turned away. The case was complete, not with noise, but with the quiet satisfaction of understanding, the slow certainty of a puzzle finally seen whole.